It is an honor to introduce our guest, who I think many of you would agree with me needs no introduction. But we have with us Professor Saleem Badat, who is a research professor in the History Department in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Free State in South Africa. He holds qualifications from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Boston University in the US, and a PhD in sociology from the University of York, also in the US. Saleem began his academic career in 1989 at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, where he eventually became the director of its higher education policy unit. In the course of his over 30 years career, he has held positions of significant impact, including being the first CEO of the Council of Higher Education, Program Director of International Higher Education and Strategic Projects at Andrew Mellon Foundation in New York, as well as being, of course, Vice Chancellor of Rhodes University. While his leadership positions have changed, Professor Badat has maintained immense commitment to advancing social equity, promoting academic quality, contributing to the development and developmental needs of South Africa, and ensuring institutional cultural transformation. In addition to these great strides, of course, he has authored and co-authored numerous books, including Black Student Politics, Higher Education and Apartheid from Sasso to Sangsco, 1968, 1990, which was published in 1999, Black Man, You're on Your Own, which was published by Real African Publishers in 2009, National Policy and Regional Responses in South African Higher Education, Apartheid Education, and many, many more. In 2012, Jackan Press and Brill Publishing published his book, The Forgotten People, Political Banishment Under Apartheid, and his new book, of course, published this year, 2023, is called Tennis, Apartheid and Social Justice, which was published by UKZN Press. His numerous, of course, books and book chapters and journals, policy reports, and newspaper opinion pieces have been read widely, and so we are very delighted to have him here with us. The questions that he has focused on in his academic work have primarily been around questions of equity, redress, social justice in and through universities, and not to forget decolonization and transformation of universities in societies that were colonized. At present, Prof. Badat directs a research project on the histories of universities in South Africa that involves several universities and scholars. We are absolutely grateful to have Prof. Badat with us today as he reflects on the questions of research on, for, with, in, and of Africa in relation to knowledge making in the arts, humanities, and social sciences and contemporary global North hegemony. Prof. Badat, thank you so much for honoring our invitation at HUMA. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for that kind invitation. So in this presentation today, I want to draw on diverse experiences as a scholar, policy advisor, a university leader, and foundation grant maker on a particular epistemic and geographical location, and on a specific biopolitics to address this question. How do we contest global North hegemony in knowledge creation, overcome Africa's subordinate position in global scholarship, and advance knowledge that serves Africans' needs? And I engage this question, as Vanessa has indicated, by focusing on the issues of research on, for, within, and of Africa in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. To begin with, let me observe that unequal social relations shape who produces knowledge, whose and what knowledges are valued, privileged and subordinated, in what languages knowledge is principally produced, who has and who does not have voice, who publishes, and what is published. They also shape the knowledge orientations and agendas of universities and impinge on the creation and sharing of knowledge. Unequal relations in the field of knowledge in turn reproduce unequal relations in the economic and social spheres between the North and the South. Recent years have seen welcome struggles to contest hegemonic Western thinking on and approaches to knowledge. These struggles, I submit, are critical for liberating scholarship from old, tired, and pernicious orthodoxies that actually impede knowledge making, arbitrarily value certain modes of knowledge making, and constrained ultimately thought and research. They are critical too for creating African universities, as opposed to the current replicas and mimics of universities in the colonial metropoles. What is the purpose of undertaking research on Africa and issues related to Africa? And this is neither self-evident nor without dispute. One intention may be to advance understanding of our natural and social worlds and enrich our scientific and cultural heritage through producing new knowledge. Another purpose may be to grapple with contemporary and urgent problems and to seek solutions in the form of policies and technologies. But beyond the question of purpose is that of interest. Whose interest does research on Africa serve? Whose interests are ignored and whose interests should be served? Given the entanglement of knowledge and power, how is the public common good to be safeguarded in the face of the usually narrow private interests of dominant elites? What should be the concerns of research on Africa? What should be prioritized? And key goals? What strategies should be used? And how should research be resourced? Ultimately, what are African goals and priorities are both the objects and the outcomes of struggles between and within different classes, social groups, and institutions. And now I'll turn to another question. Does research on Africa, wherever it may be undertaken, create knowledge that is for Africa? We know that it often does not. Asymmetries between the global North and South mean inequities in resources and infrastructure for research and publishing that often compromises research pertinent to African needs and goals. However, the question of research that is for Africa is not without problems. Knowledge making for Africa cannot be about propaganda that masquerades as research, or research that serves simply elites. Advancing knowledge on and for Africa means grappling with urgent problems and seeking solutions to these. But it also means testing the knowledge produced by previous generations. It means undertaking research into the most arcane and abstract issues and the most theoretical and intractable uncertainties of knowledge. And it means probing issues that are not immediately relevant to others, but have the potential to yield great future benefit. It means scholars and universities fairly asking critical questions, and in the spirit of truth, pursuing these questions wherever they may lead. Concomitantly, I think Edward Said provides wise counsel. There is always something radically incomplete, insufficient, provisional, disputable, and arguable about humanistic knowledge, which is what we are concerned with. We must be critical of humanism in the name of humanism, not least because our experience of Eurocentrism and empire reveal how humanistic thought has justified all kinds of abuses. Our task in the global South is to fashion a different kind of humanism that is cosmopolitan, rather than a parochial Afrocentrism or unacceptable alternate glib universalizing of the kind that we get from Europe. We must approach our tasks, in Said's words, as an unsettling adventure in difference, in alternative traditions, in texts that need a new deciphering within a much wider context than has been hitherto given them. Northern interests in research on Africa, linked to their ideas on internationalization, is connected with national economic and political interests and specific institutional interests. It occurs within persistent asymmetries and practices that assume the superiority of Western modes of knowing and theorizing, and they confound equitable North-South relationships. We, I believe, must insist on a different internationalization logic: social solidarity, global public good, respect for difference and diversity, social inclusion, reciprocity, and mutual benefit for countries, institutions, and individuals. A commitment to research that is not just on Africa, but also for Africa, and advances African goals, priorities, and interests. Knowledge for Africa, I believe, means forging strong networks amongst Africans instead of relying only on partnerships with the global north, which are often driven by funding areas of research that are more important to them than necessarily to us. It means being involved in international research networks to give a voice to priorities for research in African countries. And research for Africa needs not be conducted in Africa or by Africans alone. That would be far too parochial. Commitment to African sovereignty and development is far more important, I think, than location, birth, or origins. And research that is for Africa also cannot have Africa as its only object. Our research must theorize and analyze the foreign policy and aid regimes of the United States, Europe, Russia, and China, the workings of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, and other global bodies and the like. All of those impact on us. Too many North-South relationships evince the dominance of Northern institutions and dominant perspectives and beliefs and practices that unfortunately relegate Southern universities to the status of junior partners, receivers of knowledge, and providers of talent or data. Genuine partnership is something different. It means institutions and scholars from different countries working together equitably, reciprocally, and respectfully, appreciating that common effort can yield great benefits than working separately. It means jointly identifying questions and opportunities, and sensitively and diligently cultivating and sustaining collaborations, using our respective insights, locations, and resources to exchange ideas authentically to achieve common goals. And yet power relations, asymmetries, unfortunate assumptions, and ingrained historical practices often make successful North-South partnerships difficult, demanding, and elusive. We know that a global economy of knowledge centered on the elite institutions of the metropole is a massive fact. It shapes established disciplines and new domains, and it affects training, funding, research methods, publication, prestige, and recognition. The concepts academic dependency and extraversion denote how Global South scholars are orientated to and dependent on the institutions, concepts, and techniques of the metropole, and how the intellectual labor process in the Global South is arranged to confer Global North institutions predominant authority. This authority is exercised directly, as when Global North funders define the problems for researchers in the South, or it's exercised indirectly through such practices as researching within an established methodological framework or teaching curricula modeled on those of Northern institutions. And yet, Global South scholars are not merely hapless, passive victims of extraversion. Individuals and institutions contest and push back against unequal relations, creatively exploit opportunities, and advance knowledge from the Global South. Jess Aubach, a colleague of yours at the University of Cape Town, notes that contemporary research practices were integral to the process of European domination of global knowledge systems, and that the well-being of the majority of the planet is compromised by the dominance of one culture of knowledge and knowing. She advances what I think are thoughtful ideas for more equitable knowledge practices around the globe. And in summary, these ideas include a decolonization of the mind, historical awareness of both dominant and contesting histories of space, place, and relationship, the decolonization of data, a diversity of lenses through which sources are interpreted, epistemological, theoretical, and methodological innovation, a decolonization of expertise, inclusive teams, a substantive diversity that is not skin deep, and place for relationship, care, and commitment. One can elaborate on each of these ideas. I suggest you read her paper, which I think is important. Beyond research on Africa and for Africa is a question of research with African universities and scholars. It means involving meaningfully African scholars who possess theoretical, methodological, and empirical insights shaped by space and place. And it means contributing to Southern efforts to build institutional capacities and individual research capabilities. And it means partnering around this with modesty, not arriving on the continent assuming you know what capacities have to be built and that you know how to build those capacities. We do know how to build capacities ourselves in Africa. We do it under resource constraints, and we do a pretty good job. So the partnership that we're looking for is of a different kind. Collaboration with African universities cannot be limited to research on Africa, even if it is for Africa. Globalization and a rampant 4 decades of neoliberalism have accentuated old economic and social problems and have triggered new problems at local, national, and global levels. If planetary changes have especially acute implications for Africa, they are global in nature. The vast and complex challenges that confront humanity, the wicked problems, as we say, of humanity, must be studied collectively and from multiple perspectives that span disciplines and fields. It requires diverse teams, intellectually and socially. It also requires a transnational and global concept of public interest and public good, rather than the kind of slogan we have become familiar with, America first. I now want to turn to the question of research in Africa. And in the interest of time, I will not say more on this issue. It is trite that arts, humanities, and social science research on Africa must occur principally in Africa and be undertaken by Africans. And yet we are aware of the many challenges in this regard. The harnessing of universities for economic and political advantage means that knowledge generated by the natural, medical, and business sciences and engineering is privileged. The perverse obsession with global university rankings reinforces such privileging, as does the chase for research subsidy by universities in South Africa. The arts and humanities are either benignly tolerated or outrightly neglected. One example, President Ramaphosa's Fourth Industrial Revolution Commission. A fourth industrial revolution, if it's real, that will have a huge impact on humanity. The entire commission comprises one person from the arts, humanities, and social sciences, and that, with due respect, not even a senior scholar. The late Thandika Makandawire advanced many good reasons why the arts and the humanities especially should not be neglected. I want to conclude with the question of research that is not only on and for Africa, conducted by and with African scholars and institutions, and undertaken principally in Africa, but research that is also of Africa. And I'm very poignantly reminded that when I became Vice Chancellor of Rhodes University in 2006, I was reminded that Rhodes University was in the Eastern Cape, but it was not of the Eastern Cape. And there was also some doubt whether it was for the Eastern Cape. So how do we generate research of Africa and for Africa? We know that colonialism and apartheid wreaked not only havoc on indigenous and Black people physically, they also impacted thinking and thought, particularly how the dominated came to acquire knowledge, understand their history, comprehend their world, and define themselves. The concept of coloniality encapsulates beautifully, I think, the European epistemology, ontology, and ideology that underpinned and legitimized European domination and knowledge. The emergence of a colonial epistemic monoculture and the decimation and marginalization of the knowledges, cultures, language, and experience of colonized people, what Boaventura Santos calls epistemicide. Imbued with an imperialist and racist outlook, European epistemology unilaterally assumed the right to stipulate what knowledge was and how it was produced, proclaiming its scientific truths universal and valid across all of time and space and place. Eurocentrism constituted the geoculture of the modern world, and it powerfully shaped and continues to do so science and knowledge in universities everywhere, including South Africa. Yet, as Said points out, this European claim of the universality of its ideas conveniently erases its own particularity. It obscures how this claim is sustained through the exercise of material power in the world and the ways in which relations of power underpin both knowledge as well as the possibilities of its production, and it also shapes its dissemination. Eurocentrism also impedes human understanding. In Said's words, its misleading, skewed historiography, the parochiality of its universalism, its unexamined assumptions about Western civilization, and its attempt to impose a uniformly directed theory of progress all end up reducing rather than expanding the possibility of Catholic inclusiveness, of genuine cosmopolitan or internationalist perspective, of intellectual curiosity. Education based on Western canons also erase the traditions of others. And it must therefore be submitted, as it is being, to radical humanistic critique. Said also importantly noticed that academic disciplines, fields, and curricula were shaped by social struggles. The historical exclusion of fields like African, gender, critical race, and post-colonial studies in universities demonstrates the parochialism of classical Eurocentric humanistic thought and its disregard for the historical experiences of women and disadvantaged and marginalized groups. And in front of our eyes today, we can see this happening again in the United States and especially in Florida with the virtual banning, in spite of notions of academic freedom, of critical race theory, and particular African-American authors. Of course, the epistemic dependency of countries and of their scholars and intellectuals is not an original state. It is a product of colonial subjugation and unequal relations over centuries. So, in the words of the famous man, what is to be done? For Walter Mignolo, political and epistemic delinking and decolonizing knowledge and decolonial knowledges are critical for imagining and building democratic, just, and non-imperial, non-colonial societies. Delinking means jettisoning Eurocentrism and its assimilative and isomorphic rationalities. It is not, however, a turn to nativism that harks back to some imaginary pure and glorious past or some anachronistic nationalism. Rather, we must appropriate, subsume, and redefine the emancipatory rhetoric of modernity in order to understand citizenship, democracy, economic relations, human rights, and humanity beyond the narrow definitions of European modernity. It is to study Africa from inside and to generate endogenous intellectual discourses that enable Africans to speak for themselves, about themselves, in a non-hegemonic conversation with the rest of the world. And a decolonial epistemic perspective requires a broader canon of thought than simply the Western canon. It must be the result of the critical dialogue between diverse, critical, epistemic, ethical, and political projects towards a pluriversal, as opposed to a universal world shaped in the image of Europe. For Ramon Grossvogel, a horizontal, liberatory dialogue, as opposed to a vertical Western monologue, requires the decolonization of global power relations. And that is entirely true. But currently, let us be honest, we are some distance from that. It is hard to imagine elites, states, even our universities and scholars in Africa embracing a radical political delinking. Given this, the optimal strategy may be for scholars, universities, and Pan-African institutions and supporters in the global north to mobilize for, first, to borrow from a very interesting book by Sabelo Gacciani and Lovo and others, to mobilize for the de-imperialization of epistemology, theory, and methodology, to mobilize for the decolonization of knowledge, however we may come to discuss and agree on what decolonization means. It is about demanding global north humility about their knowledge claims and demanding global south inclusion and access at all stages of research. And there are some promising signs in this regard. If Eurocentrism and Northern hegemony result in global cognitive injustice, the struggle for global social justice, if it is to be meaningful, must be a struggle for cognitive justice too. It means being alert not only to other forms of knowledge, but also to the diverse communities of problem solving that exist. And it's about recognizing that diversity and a diversity of knowledge is crucial for cognitive justice. So the task of scholarship then becomes, in my view, to deconstruct the standard narratives based upon the universalization of what are ultimately parochial European histories. It is to provincialize ideas that are based on European experiences, but glibly universalized globally, irrespective of time, space, and place. It is to reconstruct global narratives on the basis of the empirical connections forged through histories of colonialism, enslavement, dispossession, and appropriation, which means working across those that were formerly colonized and working within the global south. And it's about building counter-hegemonic understandings and uses of Eurocentric concepts, such as human rights, the rule of law, democracy, and socialism. Undertaking this work is about more than just geographic or social location. It is fundamentally about thinking, researching, and writing from a decolonial epistemic location. And what that decolonial epistemic school or thinking or paradigm is something we, of course, have to grapple with. There are no glib, easy answers to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Prof. We will take a round of questions and then we will ask for you to respond to those. So please feel free to put your hand up in the chat. And okay, so I see we have two hands, one from Derek and another from Laura. We will take them in that order. Derek, please go ahead. Derek, are you able to hear us? Okay, it seems we are unable to get a hold of Derek. Laura, I believe your hand was also up. Please do unmute and have your time in the spotlight. Okay, I think we might have, okay, so we might just ask for another round of questions. I will take the liberty of making the most out of my privilege as the chair and ask my question, Prof. Sure. So I just wanted to ask you to perhaps elaborate a bit more in thinking about how we might think about managing diversity and cohesion within, thinking about different knowledges, right? Particularly in the university, but also beyond. I imagine that is not an easy task, and I think it's a big question, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that and how we might make that a viable possibility for universities and societies in the future.
Sure, thanks, Vanessa, and very important question. So, in critically reflecting on my term at Rhodes University, one of the things I came to realize that there's an important difference, a relationship, but also a difference between diversity and inclusion. You can be diverse, but that doesn't mean that you meaningfully include, whether it's Black students or Black staff or knowledges too. And so we need a commitment to both diversity and meaningful inclusion. It's what Biko reminds us many years ago. We don't just want visibility, we want meaningful participation, right? And so how we advance diversity and inclusion within our universities is a very fundamentally important task that we need to grapple with all the time. And when I say we, I mean all the constituencies that make up the university, not just the vice-chancellor or the leadership of the university, students, academics, workers, and so on. Because it's really a very important challenge, this deracializing, demasculinizing, decolonization of our institutional culture, which includes our academic culture. So many of these tasks, Vanessa, I see as not the work of a single profound scholar or intellectual. I see these as collective tasks that we engage on through seminars like this, but we also engage on through working groups, through task teams, and so on, where we grapple with these issues in the most kind of profound ways rather than in glib ways and declare easy victories and so on. And these are, I think, generational tasks that we must start engaging with today if we want to see a real fundamental change in our universities, because there's far too much lip service to transformation. And that transformation has been reduced ultimately just to demographics, rather than profound issues in a university which are related to knowledge. So I think, different universities will approach this in different ways. And I'm all for deep and often even respectful disagreements around these issues about what kind of decolonial approach helps us in terms of theorizing from an African location. What kinds of methodologies, epistemologies, and so on. Because the stakes are profound here. And these are not easy questions. And I'm tired of glib answers to some of these kinds of issues. When we know that, Twitter responses or WhatsApp responses, these are profound issues that we need to start grappling with.
Sure. Thanks, Prof. And if I may, what have we gotten right, say, in the last 25, 30 years? And what could we be doing or should be thinking about to move forward in a productive way?
I think that's very important, Vanessa. I think, especially us in South Africa, given the kind of conjuncture we find ourselves in, the disappointment that we are experiencing, given what Madiba had to say on this day 29 years ago, and the future that he kind of held out for us, and given where we are today, where we are struggling to keep energy and power going. I think we must also reflect critically in ways that don't simply thrash everything. This narrative of things were better under apartheid is not only a wrong narrative, it's a disgraceful narrative. glibly made. So as much as we have critical challenges and profound challenges and so on, we must also recognize the advances that we have made post-1994. And that reminds us too, that if you want to materialize this wonderful slogan that the ANC came up about, a better life for all, and we are far away from that, then it reminds us the kind of work that still has to be done in many arenas of our society, including our universities. And that makes us ask hard questions about the role of our universities post-1994 too, and whether we have succumbed to fads and fashions that do not enable us to serve our society and this continent adequately. But that's a different kind of issue. But if the universities are not going to be thinking and theorizing and so on around these issues, and I don't want to argue that the university is the only place where this kind of thinking happens. Wonderful thinking happens outside of universities too. Intellectuals are not confined to universities. In fact, many university scholars are not strictly public intellectuals, they're just scholars, right? Many public intellectuals exist outside of the universities. But that's suggesting that we need to engage far more publicly and robustly around the critical issues of the day than perhaps we are doing. That we need to have a much greater visibility as scholars and universities in the cut and thrust of the engagements that are happening in our society.
Wow. Thank you, Prof, so much. We do have a follow-up question from Sanya as well as Abonga. I will read Abonga's question first because it is in text, and then we will have Sanya follow up after your response. Abonga is asking, why is it difficult to delink, Prof? You mentioned delinking, so now please elaborate on why it is difficult to do so. We had this discussion in our session this morning, and there seems to be no single answer to this. And
Sure.
Abonga would like to hear your thoughts.
No, I think Abonga is absolutely right to ask that question. Why is it difficult? Because I think of historical structure and conjuncture, by which I mean the social relations under which we live and which are dominant and which are powerfully reproduced all the time. And it also has to do with the disarray on the side of those who consider themselves progressive or left and so on. It's about the pernicious hegemony of neoliberal thinking that also infects our universities and many of our academics, to be blunt. So in this conjuncture, in this largely unipolar world, which is about Western hegemony, and which unipolarity is dissolving slowly, okay? It means that the dependence of African countries and countries on the global south, and if not dependence, the subjection of us to the strictures of what you call the Washington Consensus. Look at Ukraine and the insistence on towing a particular NATO line on that. And the punishment of those countries or individuals who want to walk the trend. All that makes political and epistemic delinking very difficult. And so my reading might be different, and I would like us to engage around this. But I don't see many African countries, let alone countries in the global south. I don't see many universities in Africa embracing that kind of delinking, even though politically and strategically, it might be the right approach. Our institutions, our countries are highly engaged and wanting to remain engaged, often with former colonial powers, with the imperialist world, if you like. So that's why I'm a little somewhat pessimistic about whether that radical core, which I agree with intellectually and politically, is on the table today until conditions change. And those conditions in social structure and conjuncture will not change by waiting for the change. It has to be changed by social action, by mass struggles in the global south and in Africa and in our countries.
Thank you for those insights, Prof. I will now give over to Sanya, who had his hand up to ask a question.
Well, thank you so much, Vanessa. Thanks, Prof, for such a very broad overview of knowledge production in Africa. You know, my question actually is was quite similar to what Abonga asked. I was very fascinated by the concept of delinking. You know, that's what I wanted to ask you, but you've responded. But I'm also aware that you're doing a lot of important work on institutions of higher learning in former British colonies. Now, these are, and then the kinds of knowledge production programs, mechanisms, and what have you that they're undertaking now. That has changed from colonial times to post-colonial times. Now, what are the having worked in institutions like Mellon, what are the opportunities for doing this kind of work today? Important work like that we need to, and because they are, it's multinational in scope, with a whole range of scholars from multiple disciplines and having different methodologies. What are the possibilities in Africa for undertaking such huge projects?
Sure. So, Sanya, and here's the paradox, right? The project that I'll mention briefly that hopefully you will be involved in also, which is potentially a very exciting project. Let's be honest, the prospect of us raising the money for this exciting, important project on the African continent is very little. We're going to have to find that money from hopefully sympathetic donors in Europe or the United States or elsewhere. Okay? And that's a paradox. Okay? That we in Africa will not fund this kind of research easily. And we will say this is not really relevant, and we will find the money for science and technology and engineering projects and so on, and research in those areas. But for an important humanities project of the kind that I'll mention in a moment, we're going to struggle. And I've been very honest about that. And whatever the issues there may be with the Mellon Foundation, and it is ultimately a US foundation, and we know it has pulled out entirely of South Africa and the rest of the world in 2019. The Mellon Foundation provided incredible support to UCT, to Rhodes, to Pretoria, UWC, and others. As you know, my budget at that time was about $20 million a year. And we are funding important initiatives in humanities and arts and social sciences, not just at university in South Africa, but we had moved also to Makerere and Ghana and Cairo and Beirut and those places. With the departure from the scene of the Mellon Foundation, to its shame, I think, because ultimately I think it fell into the America First trap. We are experiencing some real problems. And that's why when Vanessa told me earlier that you have 30 people at HUMA, I said, wow, are you flush with money? That's exciting. Because I don't know many places today that can sustain staff like that in the humanities through funding directly from their own university. So I must assume you are getting money from the US or Europe, right? Because our own universities do not take these projects like HUMA and WISER and CHR sufficiently seriously. I don't say they don't support, they do, right? But their priorities tend to be elsewhere rather than arts and humanities. And we are not even working hard enough to bring the humanities and arts into a conversation of the social sciences and to bring all of them into a conversation with sciences, engineering, and so on. Because you and I know the wicked problems of our world, inclusive cities that are safe for women, for example, or for refugees and so on, cannot be solved by architects and town planners and engineers. They need the arts and humanities there to help address these kinds of problems. So my concern increasingly, and that's what you're alluding to, has moved away directly from policy, which I've done for years and which remains important. But it's become much more historical and sociological. So my Histories of Universities project in South Africa today, where we are working on critical institutional histories of 7 universities, my own project on the history of university in South Africa, is really concerned about where our universities come from. What is the idea of the university that holds us and has held us captive from the colonial period through to segregation, through to apartheid, through post? What are the continuities and discontinuities? To what extent are we breaking with certain highly Eurocentric ideas of what the university is? Are we taking place in space seriously enough? So my concerns there are ultimately about decolonization and transformation. That history is exciting, I've learned. But my historical sensibilities, my historical questions, and my work on history is related to contemporary questions of transformation and social justice and so on. So Sanya was really referring to the idea of putting together a team that brings together people from South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Egypt, West Indies, Malaysia, India, to look at how universities were created in those countries that were all British colonies, and what the experiences have been over the last 50, 60 years of those universities. And what do they look like today? Each one having been, by and large, the product of colonial thought. And they were essentially colonial institutions that borrowed from Scotland and England, and then later the Humboldt idea from Germany. If we are serious about creating African universities rather than universities that are in Africa, then I think we need to have a better sense of our history and how that history creates possibilities, but may also put limits, and maybe you would be better equipped about why those limits exist and how we might be addressing those limits.
Thank you.
Thank you for those insights, Prof. And I think they have really inspired a whole host of follow-up questions that are related to those, and in some ways might also diverge. We have here Atina, who's asking, do indigenous methodologies have a role to play in those decolonial strategies within African higher education spaces? Or must one mimic current neoliberal behaviors towards that process? In other words, fight fire with fire.
So Vanessa, I would like to think that we should be, as Said says, catholically inclusive. That we should take from wherever we think and whatever gives us what we consider to be important theoretical, methodological resources for comprehending our reality. So we're constantly reminding ourselves that we undertake this work of scholarship, of the creation, of the making of knowledge. I don't like that word, production of knowledge. We're all becoming producers of knowledge because of subsidies, rather than because of important questions. So I think we remind ourselves that we should be Catholic, that we should borrow from wherever we think it makes sense to help us comprehend the problems of our world so that we can change these problems. Because without knowledge and interventions based on theory and knowledge, we're not likely to succeed as well as we could if we are informed by knowledge and reason, and of course, experience too. So whether indigenous methodologies or whether other kinds of methodologies, I really want to be open and embracing about. But at the same time, rather than simply see those as a panacea for everything, I think we must be free to also interrogate what comes from indigenous knowledge and culture, rather than to put it on a pedestal as it is the solution. And I really have little time for these kind of fights that go on about the superiority of one over the other, because it seems to me a danger of a different kind of universalizing now. Okay. So I've seen a very exciting essay recently, which I think is a very powerful critique of not necessarily indigenous knowledge, but how indigenous knowledge itself and those who claim to advance it can fall into all kinds of traps that ultimately do not lead to decolonization, but result in a different kind of recolonization. So I think we must advance this work inclusively, with great respect for diversity and difference, and critically, because far too much is at stake. This is not about egos, you know. It's not about the superiority of the post-colonial rather than the decolonial, or of Marxist theory. I think we need to be open and critical and Catholic about forging the theoretical and methodological and other kind of tools and resources, ultimately to comprehend our realities in Africa and globally in order to change those realities.
And Ahmed is reminding us, Prof, of the words of Edward Said, that to speak of Africa is to enter a fight over Africa, since Africa is an unspeakable agency in global systems. So the question then that emerges from that is, can we, and is it possible to generate a knowledge through these universities? Can we have knowledge production through these universities?
Well, I think implicit in what I've said is that unless we remake, fundamentally decolonize and transform our universities in Africa because of their histories, because of the histories of the disciplines like anthropology and other disciplines. So when I was at the Mellon Foundation, let me share, millions of dollars came into South Africa to support this decolonial project at all the universities. And I think it'd be very good to have the Mellon Foundation is not interested anymore, it's pulled out. It'd be very good for someone to do some research, maybe at UMA or WISER or somewhere, out of one of those units, of looking at what happened with all that monies and to what extent it has really advanced our thinking around how we might approach the decolonization of our universities. And to what extent, and this is a big question too, to what extent is transformation really on the agenda in South Africa? Because there's more lip service paid to transformation than it seems to me any substantive, meaningful transformation and grappling with transformation on a consistent, concerted, and thoughtful basis. And I've already suggested that I think dangerously we have reduced transformation to demographics, counting how many women, important, how many Black people, and especially African scholars and students, important. But we haven't really substantively tackled profound epistemological, ontological, and knowledge issues. And we really haven't tackled the question of what is the purpose of universities? What are their functions and roles in Africa as opposed to Europe or North America? What is it that we want of our universities? And so I think we need a deep and meaningful engagement around these issues by our universities. And if our universities are not doing this, I'm not sure it's going to happen. I certainly don't see the Ministry of Higher Education undertaking some kind of exercise like this. So here we have the paradox that we have to lead this decolonizing and transforming. But you might argue we're also trying to do it under very difficult conditions in South Africa. That as much as there's a lot of money for students today, and I welcome that through NSFAS, our universities are often being starved of resources. And look at what is happening in many areas of our university. especially in relation to quality?
Sure. Prof, to pick your brain for the last couple of minutes, I think we have about 4 minutes left. I will ask Letu's question, perhaps by phrasing it as, can and are there organizations that we can lobby, like for instance, can we lobby BRICS to finance the humanities and recenter the arts, the social sciences, and the humanities?
So, I think it's very important to have a certain point of departure and keep in our minds that we shouldn't be like assuming that money that comes from anywhere else, whether from the EU or from foundations in the United States or China and so on, is immediately and obviously tainted and comes with conditions. Sometimes that funds don't come with conditions, right? And so therefore, we should be looking for funding, as long as it doesn't compromise us intellectually and compromise our dignity, right? Or reduces us to subordinate partners in global partnerships and the like. So we have to constantly and diligently look for support and funding. And as Sanya knows, we are trying to do that for this, what I think is a very big and exciting project of looking at how universities developed in British colonies and where they are today. It's trying to bring me together, Sanya, Sabelo Gachenin, Lovu, Paul Zelezar, Ahmed Bawa, and various other people. So, and of course, it has to be diverse in terms of gender too. And hopefully with exciting young scholars, because otherwise the age is too much towards 65. Okay. So in the short term, we have to look for those funds, whether they come from BRICS and elsewhere, as long as they don't compromise us intellectually. But ultimately, the solution to this is not handouts from those parts of the world. Even though we may say, those are not handouts, all that money ultimately is, you can treat it as reparations to us, because we know where that historically those funds have come from. But unless African governments and as Africa, and however we might want to conceive Africa, I think we have to think about that too, is what is Africa? Right? Until our own governments start to understand the importance of knowledge and support arts and humanities so that it can take its place in contributing to building prosperous, decent societies in Africa, we will constantly be dependent on others and others' agendas also.
Indeed. And with those words, Prof, we'd like to thank you so much once again for honoring our invitation. We do look forward to hosting you again at HUMA and engaging more of your work. We'd also like to thank everyone for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you at our other seminars. We do have a number of other seminars ongoing at HUMA, so please do check out our social media as well as our website for details on those. And from the rest of us here at HUMA, we wish you a wonderful afternoon further.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I enjoyed that.
Thank you, Prof.